looking for escapism, I just want to escape.
Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Well, unless you've been living under a rock for the past few years, you would have heard terminology such as equality, diversity, and wokeness. Now, these things have long since lost their original meanings due to being cannibalised by corporations and activists who are trying to advance their own agendas, tokenism, and virtue signalling, and sadly, these words now drastically divide opinion. Now, I don't do politics on my channel for a very simple reason. My channel is about psychology, character, education, and entertainment, all through the prism of film, and I don't want politics or identity politics to overshadow this. Films are entertaining escapism, exciting stories I can connect with, and an emotional release where I can shut off my horrible life, the horror of the outside world, and enjoy things like dinosaurs, revenge, space battles, tsunami disasters, and even historical biopics. Politics and agendas, on the other hand, are divisive, and whilst I want realism and excitement and I am open to a movie tackling modern day topics, I want it done through facts, accurate reflections and context, not opinions and tokenism. Maybe some parts of Hollywood are in a post-Harvey Weinstein phase where they are making an emotionally expressive apology for a culture which they were complicit in creating, but now exposed, they are confusing reparational shame with entertainment. Weinstein's actions were well known in the corridors of Hollywood. Lana Del Rey's now retired song Cola was inspired by him, and his arrest showed the true extent of the problem, which had devastated many lives. And maybe Hollywood realised that once the Weinstein pebble fell, it needed to clean up its act, but like all sensible causes, once the extremists got hold of it, the message and reparations went from interesting commentary and change to ridiculous virtue signalling and following the noisiest minorities and loudest voices on social media. Now, for context, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. That was my childhood, and compared to the 70s and 80s, prejudice, tolerance, openness, diversity, and all the way through to living conditions and tasty food has improved dramatically. Society is moving in the right direction. We're doing good. I'd much rather be alive in 2023 than I would in 1978. So, staying with this identity politics theme, why are some parts of Hollywood so scared of showing failure and putting some of its female leads through hell at this moment in time? Why have we gone from great characters on a journey to Mary Sues and agendas overshadowing characterisation? Is it identity politics? Is it Hollywood forcing writers to toe the line and tell them they need to put these things in their movies? Or am I just a 47-year-old man who doesn't understand the world has changed and things have moved on? Like I said before, I steer well clear of politics because it's divisive, tribalistic and confrontational, and movies should just be movies where the most important thing is character, emotion, developing character arcs, and memories which last a lifetime because the movie scared, moved, or made you just laugh. However, and coming back to the problem of agendas in movies, Kathleen Kennedy's The Force is Female, most obvious one of the areas where Hollywood has lost its way, be it down to agendas or identity politics or writers who just don't understand, is how it portrays failure. You see, mistakes don't make you stupid, and failure is not a sign of weakness. Also, weakness is not a sign of failure. All of us have been failing or making mistakes all of our lives from the minute we tried to stagger across the living room carpet to get a cuddly toy when learning to walk. And when I speak of psychology and using film to exemplify it, it's because all characters have psychological methods, motivations, dilemmas and trials, and film is a wonderful teaching tool as well as a great entertaining tool, and that's why I use it. Now, when I used to teach students on psychiatric wards, I would always tell them they won't learn just by getting things right. They will get their greatest education when they do something wrong. And that's because we get our most vivid feedback when we fail. It's in failure that we get mental scars of consequences, that we memorise moments as metaphysically unforgettable frames of frozen time because they remain so vivid, and we grow because of these. Our neocortexes code pathways much more linear, like a neurosynaptic scar, when something goes wrong or we are put in peril. How many times have you heard someone say, "Never again, I will never fall for that again," with such conviction that you can hear the gravitas in their tone or see the seriousness in their face? We remember how we went wrong because it codes a survival technique to avoid those uncomfortable feelings ever happening again. Even when we are at our youngest and our spongy brains are still forming their synaptic connections, we learn what hurts us and what not to do again. And in films, we want to see characters develop by the same methods. It's the A to Z of storytelling. We want to see our characters change, lose, grapple with tragedy and adversity, and grow so that by the end of the story, we share and feel in their success or even emote in their tragedy if a sacrifice has had to be made. I've written a few books in my time, and yes, each book I have written has always had a female-centred character. My last one, The Rockroach, was my first real foray into slasher, unstoppable serial killer horror, and was a bit autobiographical in the sense of my traverses and failings to pass job interviews. It's why my lead character Keely spends the first 2 chapters trying to better herself, only to fall upon the nerves which stymie her tongue and the prejudice of people who don't know what it's like to struggle. Now, part of the reason I always traverse into female characters is because when I was young, my dad left us and I grew up with a strong matriarch in an all-female household, but also because from the age of 13, the only films I ever watched were horror films. And what do horror films usually have? They usually have a final girl or a vulnerable female lead. Now, yes, there's lots of sexual sublimation and issues of masculinity and strength, but when you are being chased by a 7-foot monster with a machete, it doesn't matter how much of a feminist you are. It's a horror film, and I just want my characters to be in danger so I can go on the journey with them, emote with them, and be scared with them. The point I'm making is my imprinting from a young age in film was with Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, The Fog, Slumber Party Massacre, Child's Play, and the list can go on and on. I was a lonely 13-year-old, and all the way through to being 17 years old, I was bullied at school, consumed movies on a daily basis, had no friends, and movies became my window to a world of escapism. Anyway, let's stay with my female horror and final girl angle, go back in time to a period where failure made our heroines iconic, and discuss the psychological and emotional benefits of the slasher genre's final girl as they fight for their lives against the psychotic or evil entity which was trying to kill them. And let's go back in time and assess these characters, their psychology, and how they developed so we can study these pre-woke warriors which inspired a horror-loving generation and showed that, minus all the agendas and internet hyperbole, what a strong female character was really about and what they could really do. Right then, let's crack on. So, first things first, what is a final girl? Well, according to Evie magazine, the consummate definition is, the final girl is the last girl standing in a horror film, usually in a slasher film, who outlives all of her friends or the other victims and confronts the killer in the end. She has consistent characteristics which largely revolve around being not like the other girls in the horror movie. Now, in the slasher movie, the final girl wasn't like the other girls because she was often dowdy, virtuous, didn't take drugs or smoke, didn't drink alcohol, certainly didn't have sex, and would always get the proverbial poo kicked out of her, either over the whole film or certainly via some life or death scraps with the killer at the end. And the reason the final girl was this way was because she was actually a gendered mirror image of the killer in terms of not being sexually active, or the odd one out, or was either picked on or ignored. However, whilst Jason, Michael, Freddy, Leatherface and so many others compensated for their sexual dysfunction by carrying a large penis extension and penetrating a long knife and stabbing teenagers, the final girl would not lose her genital virginity or life by having anything inserted deep inside of her. So, despite being slashed, beaten, pummeled and suffering quite significant injuries, her virtue always won out and the final girl would always triumph. And even when the final girl was cut, like Laurie Strode on the stairs in Halloween and Nancy in the sleep clinic in Nightmare on Elm Street, they were always cuts and not deep penetrative wounds, so their metaphorical hymens were left intact. Now, William Friedkin, director of The Exorcist, stated that slasher films were so formulaic that we identify with the girl right from the moment we are standing in line at the cinema. And the writer of Men, Women and Chainsaws, a truly excellent read I have to say, stated that the audience perception is always aligned to that of the final girl herself and not the disposable teens or the killer. Now, the golden age of the slasher started in 1978 when John Carpenter gave us the totally brilliant Halloween, and this carried on through the 80s as we visited Camp Crystal Lake, Elm Street, and plenty of other slumber parties, terror trains, prom nights, and other locations where there was a sexually dysfunctional and homicidal killer on the loose. Okay, so let's talk about failure and discuss how final girls fail and how this is shown on screen. Let's start right at the beginning, before they even cross paths or lose a friend to the stab-happy killer, and begin our final girl's psychology autopsy at their opening frames when they appear in the movie. Okay, first things first, what is failure? And what does it mean to fail, and how does it affect the brain? Well, the literal definition of failure is defined as a lack of success or the inability to meet an expectation. So what does it do to us psychologically? Bear in mind that for many of us, failure comes in many guises. It can be academic, economic, sexual, social, athletic, aesthetic, esteem-based, and it can even be due to circumstantial problems where what we are good at doesn't match how we are living our lives. And that's the important thing to remember about failure. It doesn't define you, yet it's something that you may have to endure, and it will make you stronger because of those vivid life lessons you learn from it. Remember, failure is a learning process we all endure at some point, so it's important that our skills develop from the difficult experiences and feelings it brings. Now, reward and failure operate different parts of our brain chemistry. So, when we experience a success, our brains release endorphins, dopamine, and serotonin, which all encourage us to engage to do the same thing again and get better and better at it so we can get more endocrinal rewards. However, when we experience a failure, our brains release cortisol, and it does not leave us with the same feelings of acceptance and safety. High levels of cortisol can lead to depression, stress, low self-esteem and anxiety, and all of these are called negative valences. We can also feel that things are out of control, and this leads to hopelessness. It's here that willpower, determination, and exposure to the reverse of the pleasure-pain principle come into play. The pleasure-pain principle is a simple psychological theory that dictates that all humans seek pleasure and avoid pain, yet when we fail, we sometimes have to keep returning to the stimulus and experiencing the same feelings of pain again and again as we try to master the skill we can't quite get right. So, we may get rejected by girls or boys, be laughed at in sports, or, as in Mike Keeley's case in The Rockroach, be ridiculed and patronised in ever-worsening job interviews. For the final girl, she can have equal or even tougher rites of passages, often struggling at the very start of the film, competing with more sexually proficient cheerleaders, or managing a home life where the parents are separating or the fathers are drunk. So, first things first, let's look at situational dynamics, as these are not to do with failure, but they set the challenges our final girls will have to hurdle and, more than likely, will fail at doing so. In Halloween, Laurie Strode is dowdy, struggles to pretend she likes smoking, is chronically introverted and always the butt of the jokes, and can only dream of the sex and hedonism of Linda and Annie's lives. Laurie is so meek and mild that she even rejects Ben Tramer, who's been asked out on her behalf. For Nancy, in A Nightmare on Elm Street, she's going out with Johnny Depp, so win-win there, ladies. However, her parents are separated, her mother is an alcoholic, and, although having divorcing parents isn't a sign of failure, it's gonna add problems of believability and help when Big Bad arrives with his razored glove. Kirsty Cotton from Hellraiser also has some challenging family dynamics, and Sarah Carter from The Descent has lost both her cheating husband and her child in a tragic car accident at the start of the film. Even Sally in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I mean the original 1974 best ever version, has to manage a disabled brother and is checking that her grandfather's grave hasn't been robbed during their road trip. All of our final girls have one thing in common. An antagonist is about to start killing their loved ones and will ultimately come after them. In Hellraiser, Kirsty Cotton has a slightly different set of circumstances, and although she faces both the engineer Slug Thing and the Cenobites, the real big bads of the film are femme fatale Julia and her insidious partner Frank. Each of our girls makes mistakes, and these mistakes then put them in more and more mortal danger. Laurie doesn't believe Tommy about the grisly goings-on across the street, and when she does investigate it, she gets slashed and falls down the stairs, leaving her with a severe leg injury. Nancy tries to be honest about Freddie, but merely makes everyone think she's gone mad, and then gets locked inside her own house and has to watch as her mother and boyfriend dies. Sarah from The Descent tries to escape the crawlers, but on her first attempt of escape, she falls down a hole. In Texas Chainsaw, Sally trusts the wrong man and ends up getting captured, and Kirsty makes the mistake of opening the puzzle box whilst a little bit bored in hospital. These actions all show naivety and vulnerability, and even more so, leaves each of our girls with a sense of weakness, helplessness, and often in a worsening situation. According to Psychology Today, one of the most common and strongest feelings people have after failing is helplessness. Failure causes an emotional wound. Your mind responds to this wound by trying to get you to give up so it doesn't get wounded again, and its best way of getting you to give up is to make you feel helpless. By making you feel as if there is nothing you can do to succeed, your mind might avoid future failures, but you will be robbed of successes as well, which is why you shouldn't always listen to your feelings. And I come back to what I said earlier. Failure leaves a synaptic and deep, vivid scar. It's why we learn most from when things go wrong. For example, after finding out Ben Tramer has been asked out on her behalf and said yes, Laurie Strode urges Annie to call Ben Tramer and state it's all a mistake, as her mind is unable to face such thoughts as going out with a boy or being put in a position of humiliation. Now, we can all devalue ourselves and doubt ourselves at times, and when we are applying this to movie characters, it needs to stay congruent. Nancy from A Nightmare on Elm Street is cut from a slightly different cloth, and always pushing herself on by either going to school when asked to stay home or walking directly into the dream so she can pull Freddie out and make him mortal, she never gives in, but this determination to prove to everyone that she isn't crazy merely results in more problems. She gets locked inside her house with bars on the windows, then leads to more loss. Her boyfriend dies because she's locked in the house, and nobody believes her when she's home aloning Freddie in the house and fighting for her life while screaming for help out the window, and the police, only about 20 feet away from the door, just think she's a lunatic woman who's out of control. In The Descent, once Sarah finds out that the husband she had been mourning had been cheating on her with Juno, she initially freezes but then uses this information to galvanise her, and once she mortally wounds Juno and leaves the cave dwellers to eat her in a much deserved revenge, discovers there is no way out the cave after all, unless you saw the American version, by the way, which she did escape. Us Brits got Neil Marshall's true ending. Failure isn't weakness. It makes us more resilient, empathic, and alert. For our final girls, this is what enables them to mostly triumph, and the one thing that they all start with but eventually overcome is something called the failure schema. Hang on, what is the failure schema? Well, the failure schema is a mental imprinted pattern, and it causes feeling incapable of succeeding, a heightened sense of inferiority in comparison to others, lacking self-worth or feeling like you don't deserve something, procrastinating when you need to complete an important task, a general lack of self-confidence, and feeling a sense of shame about your progress. Now, many of our final girls have some of these symptoms at the start of the film. Laurie Strode especially, with her lack of confidence and her lacking in self-worth and feeling like she doesn't deserve something. However, all of our girls overcome this in the end. Now, the failure schema can become an imprint of self-sabotage and restriction of growth, so movie writers, take a look at our final girls and realise that, although fighting for their lives, they have to adapt and face what's trying to kill them, no matter how painful. The failure schema they may have been starting off with, chronic shyness and things like that, has to change and they have to evolve. If Nancy in A Nightmare on Elm Street was to stay stuck in the failure schema, she'll be rocking in the corner mute after sleep deprivation, the death of her friends, and all her family would think she had gone crazy. But instead of all this, she learns where others went wrong and goes on the offensive. She takes the fight to Freddie. She booby-traps the house, reads up on it, prepares her trap, and does it masterfully. Laurie Strode can't talk to boys, but she can easily shove a knitting needle into Michael Myers' neck when it comes to protecting herself and the children in her care. Kirsty Cotton trusts the Cenobites will deal with Frank and Julia, but doesn't count on their deception, so she has to close the portal herself, another example of quick thinking, to save her own life. For all these girls, life offers hazards and trauma and death and suffering, but they take it as feedback, ingrain the mental scars, and see it in their new neuro pathways and ultimately find the strength to fight on. And it's crucial in horror that people are in peril and outmatched and not Mary Sueing their way out of danger, otherwise things just aren't scary. Even Nancy's Home Alone traps fail at the end and, after sledgehammers, exploding light bulbs and setting Freddy on fire, he escapes the basement and kills her mother. So Nancy adapts from this failure to kill him and turns her back on him and shows her true strength by being brave. She breaks the failure schemer. She stands up and says, "I'm no longer scared of you." Failure doesn't always mean you aren't good at something. It just means that sometimes successes come with great losses. Now, we have three parts to our brain: the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the human brain. Basically, the reptilian brain responds to threats. The mammalian brain learns survival through social bonding, and the human brain helps us survive by learning from experience. And, staying with the triad theme, our brains interpret the world through the phenomenal field of reality and work in three distinct pathways. Number 1, encoding, how information reaches the brain and how we react to it. Number 2, storage, how we remember things. Number 3, retrieval, when we need these memories, our brains retrieve them. And as stated before, painful memories of failure and embarrassment are always more vivid, they scar deeper, they cause a mental injury, and they are retrieved much more easier from the memory. And, again staying with our little triad theme, we all operate between three states of mind. Number 1, flow. This is a state of mind where we are relaxed, calm, and enjoying things, so lots of endocrinal rewards like dopamine are hitting our system. Number 2, stress, a state of alertness, whether frightened or just playing video games or doing an exam, our mood changes and our focus narrows. Number 3, the default mode network. This is when we are daydreaming, unwinding, and is the balance between stress and flow. And failure imprints heavily on these, as we all feel stress, embarrassment, and disappointment, and we all need to release stress with fun, relaxation, and having a good time. But the default mode network is where we are at our most reflective and deals with episodic and autobiographical memory. Basically, we encode, store, and retrieve, as I said earlier, but how we encode and how we store is most often done during the default mode network as we reflect and imbibe those memories. So, between being stressed and failing and going through hell, we learn from it during times of reflection and creative planning. It's this state of mind which makes us stronger. For example, it's during the default mode network time that Nancy reads her booby trap book and plans her Freddy takedown. She wouldn't be able to focus or plan in the stress or flow mental states, so she needs this mental state, the default mode network, to succeed and plan her attack. All final girls go through hell, adapt, fail, suffer losses, but keep on going until they emerge caked in blood, bruised and battered, but ultimately triumphant in besting the horror that's been tormenting them or escaping their nightmare. Whilst current cinema wrestles with identity politics and equality, it's good to remember the warriors who defined real strong female characters. Ellen Ripley and Sarah Connor are the most prominent examples of strong female characters, but the final girl was no fool, and it was never anything to do with feminism and equality in how she survived. She got there by taking her knocks, learning from her mistakes, and getting stronger when the world backed her into a corner. Yeah, we all fight back, as that's the survival mechanism, but these girls are resourceful, resilient, and when the chips were really down, they were determined not by their failures, but by their successes that they learned through failure, loss, and brutalization. There's no shame in going through hell. It's how you come out the other side. That's the important thing. We all face challenges, and we are not always the best at everything, but we adapt, learn, avoid, and sometimes, after practice and repeated exposure, we better the opposition. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. Remember, psychology is cool. So please like, share and subscribe, and even leave a comment if you want, or leave a suggestion for a future video. And until next time, I'll catch you later.
We'll tear your soul apart.